Thanks for having me. I'm Matt Stanford, CEO of Hope and Healing Center and Institute in Houston, Texas, and I'd like to thank Dan and him Ministries for inviting me again to be here as part of the Mental Health and Faith Conference. I'd hope to be with you guys, but unfortunately I can't because of the pandemic, which we'll be talking a lot about today. But through the wonders of technology, I am with you and certainly be doing some questions and answers with you as we go through the conference this year. So let's get started. And our first presentation is titled, Are We Okay? Mental Health and Coping During and After a Pandemic. And so let's talk about really what's going on in the context of this pandemic with us from a psychological perspective and how is it affecting mental health in our population. We'll also be talking in some of the presentations about what we might be able to do to help others as they struggle with these issues. So I think it's important that we put this into context. Yes, there's a pandemic, but what is that in a greater context? In a greater context, it's a traumatic event, and we have all experienced a trauma. And I know a lot of us don't think about that way. We just think about it as kind of an inconvenience, and maybe we might get sick or someone we know might get sick, but it really is a trauma. So let me give you the definition of a traumatic event. A traumatic event is a life experience that involves actual or perceived threats to the safety and well-being of an individual or to someone close to the individual. So that clearly is this pandemic. We are certainly concerned about our own physical health and well-being, and we're certainly concerned about our loved ones. And there is a mortality aspect to this. There are a lot of people, unfortunately, that are dying from coronavirus. And so we are concerned about this from a trauma perspective when we're talking about it from mental health. So let's not minimize what has occurred. I mean, this is a trauma, and we've all experienced a trauma. So what are kind of the realistic fears that go along with a pandemic? What should we expect to see? And then how do we then look at those to determine if they've gone kind of extreme and caused a person to have some level of psychological distress that's beyond their control or normal? And so I kind of listed out a few different fears that I consider rational fears in relationship to the pandemic. One would be personal health and the health of loved ones. That's a reasonable concern. And I think the word concern might be better than fear. So we'll use fear in the context of more extreme things. We'll use concern when we're talking about kind of reasonable things. I think loss of employment. We've seen our employment rate jump here in the United States from about 3% now to around 14%. And that's pretty extreme. You know, we know that there's a suicide relationship to recessions and financial issues with the economy, and we're going to talk about that as we go through too. Isolation, I think that's a real concern that people have. I know I myself was in my house with my family for 7 weeks as we worked from home. Many people are still working from home. Many parts of the country haven't opened back up yet. So that's a real legitimate concern, is how am I going to be able to deal with this isolation? Maybe you're very much a people person, or maybe you enjoy being out, whereas other people, I have a friend who told me just the other day that she is isolationist, and this really hasn't affected her life at all in the context of that. And then our inability to obtain daily necessities. I mean, there was a period of time, strangely, where we were making runs on grocery stores to buy things. I know here in Texas, there was this odd run on toilet paper for some reason. You couldn't find toilet paper, you couldn't find paper towels, you couldn't find bottles of water. It was very, very odd. And maybe that's a concern. Maybe you're concerned about going to the grocery store and actually getting your necessities. Financial strain, beyond the loss of employment. I mean, there's a significant financial strain here. People maybe not getting paid as much. I know individuals who've gotten pay reductions as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. So that's another issue. And then finally, I think there's a concern or a fear, and I think this would be considered a fear of death. People are dying from the coronavirus. Now, it's a very small percentage of the population, a very small percentage of people who actually get the virus die, but there are people that are dying. And I think that is a legitimate concern that people would have, particularly if a person already has a pre-existing condition. So these are what I would consider reasonable pandemic-related concerns or fears, perhaps, if you use that term. So what we really want to be concerned about, though, is what happens when that goes beyond. So all of us have those. And what happens to us kind of from a physiological and a cognitive perspective when we experience a trauma? We have what you would refer to as an acute stress reaction. So that's normal, that's expected. So what would we expect to see? We would expect to see anxiety. I think we've all felt that. I know certainly in the first few days of the pandemic when we were being told that we might need to stay home or things like that, or that we were starting to see these numbers rise of people being ill in Italy and Spain and over in Europe. I think that we began to feel anxiety. It's almost palpable that you could feel things just weren't right. Irritability, that's another thing. People are a little bit on edge. People are a little bit snappier with one another. I think that was a very normal, and that's a very normal part of an acute stress reaction. Sadness, loss, sadness in the context of concern for the future. Feeling emotionally numb. I know I personally had a lot of that. You're feeling just kind of numb. You don't really know what emotion you're feeling. You don't know how to express an emotion. You don't know what the future holds. You're just kind of on a holding pattern. Difficulty concentrating. It was difficult for people to work. It was difficult for children to move to an online platform for their schooling. I know my own son who was trying to move from being at school to working online. He was struggling with kind of helping him, getting himself disciplined to do that, and he was difficulty concentrating because there's this reaction that's occurring from a stress perspective. Avoidance, a lot of people were like, I just don't want to talk about it. I don't want to watch any news. I don't want to hear about this anymore. I'm going to act like nothing's going on. That's again a reaction to this stressful event, and it's normal. A disruption in sleep patterns. I know I had a lot of trouble sleeping early on, as most people were saying. They just simply couldn't go to sleep because of that agitation, that irritability that we're feeling. And so then finally also physical complaints. I think people were complaining of, I know people were here at the Hope and Healing Center, a lot of people calling about having chest pains, a lot of headaches, a lot of vague kind of body aches. All of those things that I've just described are common and normal for an acute stress response. Something traumatic or significant has happened in your life, and your body reacts to that in an appropriate way. It gives you a stress response. Now the problem is going to be, and we'll talk about this as we go through some of the subsequent discussions, what happens when that stress response doesn't go away? What happens when you're constantly in that stress response? But right now, let's just kind of talk about what is going on with you in an acute stress response. Basically, what you're having is a fight or flight response. And so this is not just something in your head. This is not something that you can just tell your neighbor, oh, you just need to get over it. Don't worry about this. Everything's going to be fine. Just relax. Take a breath. Everything's going to be great. That really doesn't do it for most people. In fact, I would say it doesn't do it for almost anybody. If we could just kind of tell ourselves it was okay, then it really probably is kind of just a cognitive phenomenon. But the reality is an acute stress response is both a kind of a mental phenomenon, but it's also very much a physiological phenomenon as well. So what are kind of things going on in your body? Well, for instance, we know that with this high stress, individuals are going to have more cardiovascular problems because your heart is beating faster, because that's only supposed to occur for a short period of time, not a long period of time. But in an acute stress response, your heart's beating faster, your immune system is suppressed, so you're more susceptible to illness. We know that you have this higher rates of cortisol, which causes you not to metabolize food in the same way, and so you have a tendency to put on some weight. You also have some digestive issues. A lot of times people will have a lot of nausea. A lot of times people will have diarrhea. In addition, when this occurs over a long period of time, you can see hair loss, problems with the thyroid. So there's a lot of physiological things that are going on with this, because what's happening is your body is saying there's something that I should be concerned about, and it has a stress response. Your brain picks up on that. You have the cognitive aspects of stress, which is the worry, the anxiety, the irritability, and we're reacting to this situation. And all of this is just supposed to have occurred for a very short period of time. But unfortunately, with something like a pandemic, it just doesn't go away. So let's imagine a traumatic event. Your house burns down. That would be a traumatic event. Your house burns down. Okay, your house is on fire. You're concerned for your safety and your family's safety. You get out of the house burns to the ground. You've lost things. It's over. Now it's time to start rebuilding. Well, how many weeks, how many months are we into the pandemic now? And the reality is we're going to be in it for quite some time. Until we have a vaccine, this isn't going away. And even once we have a vaccine, it's going to be more like a flu probably, where it comes around seasonally, and we're going to have to be very diligent about getting our vaccine. So what happens if we are trapped within this kind of traumatic experience and we're having these kind of responses? What are the long-term effects? So those things that I just described, those are normal for an individual when they're having an acute stress response. So your house catches on fire, you have this acute stress response. It's going to last for a period of time, a week or two after that experience, but then you're going to move beyond it and then begin to live beyond that experience and move forward in your life. Well, we are kind of literally trapped within this pandemic. So what are we seeing from a mental health perspective out there right now? Well, I know, for instance, that the CDC is reporting that in assessments of a mental distress in Americans right now, you find that there's been a threefold increase over what mental distress was last year. We also are seeing suicide rates rise to frightening new levels. In fact, what the data shows us from previous economic downturns is that for every 1% increase in the unemployment rate, we see a 1.6% increase in the suicide rate. And so really very disturbing things are happening. So what we're seeing, and I can tell you from firsthand, what we're seeing here at our clinic at the Hope and Healing Centers, we're seeing significant increases in anxiety. We're seeing significant increases in depression. We're seeing a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, which will actually be the topic of a subsequent presentation that I'll be doing for you guys. We're seeing a lot of worsening of pre-existing mental health conditions. People that had their mental health problems under control, or people that were just struggling to maintain them, now they're thrown into this new situation where everything is kind of unpredictable, routines and schedules are disrupted, people are in places they weren't normally in, they're isolated or not, and suddenly their mental health problems are worsened from what they were. We're also seeing a greater use of alcohol and drugs as coping. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we're seeing a frightening increase in suicide rates. In fact, even we're recently seeing some high-profile cases where individuals in the stock market have committed suicide, as well as first responders in the New York area that were just overwhelmed by the situation they were having to deal with. So these are the mental health effects that we're seeing, and these are long-term issues. If these are not dealt with, these have the potential to really be even more destructive in some sense than the pandemic itself, because these are not things that just, let's say a vaccine occurs tomorrow, it's not suddenly everyone that now has depression is suddenly just not going to be depressed anymore. These have the potential to string out over an extremely long period of time and really cause some significant problems, even well beyond the issues that we're seeing with the virus itself. So, how do we deal with these things? What is it? We know things come, traumas come, difficulties come, challenges come. I mean, that is what it is. That is what it is to be human. And so how do we deal with that? And it's all about coping. How do we cope with the situations? So coping refers to cognitive and behavioral strategies that people use with stressful situations or difficult demands, whether they're internal or external, to deal with that situation. So how do you deal with that? So perhaps, in a very simple way, maybe when you get upset, you have a favorite movie that you like to sit down and you watch that movie and it makes you feel better. Okay, well that's a coping strategy for you. Now that's a pretty minimal situation. You're not going to just sit down and watch a movie and feel all better about the pandemic probably, but that's a way that you're coping with some minimal stress. So let's talk about different types of coping strategies, because it's important that we develop coping strategies. It's important that we develop positive coping strategies and minimize what we would refer to as negative coping strategies. Because negative coping strategies, while they may make you feel better momentarily, have negative consequences of their own, whereas positive coping strategies help you feel better in the moment. They also help take care of the situation that you're dealing with, and they have a long-term beneficial effect. If people adopt negative coping strategies, then they will have significant long-term consequences. So let's look at some positive coping strategies. And again, as I'm talking about this, think about this in the context of how you are dealing with the pandemic and the issues that go along with it. And remember, it's more than just telling yourself, I'm just going to kind of pull myself up in my bootstraps and I'm going to just be okay, because this is a trauma that we have all experienced. So positive coping strategies, talking with a friend or a loved one, Okay, I mean, have you sat down and talked with somebody about the pandemic? And I don't mean argue with them about, whether we should have masks on or whether we should stay home. I mean, talk to them about your feelings. Talk to them about how they're feeling. Talk to them about the things you're doing to make yourself feel better or what you don't feel like you control. Kind of getting it all out, giving yourself an opportunity to kind of verbalize what you're experiencing. Practice relaxation techniques. As I mentioned, a lot of us have a lot of irritability. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of sleeping issues. Well, there's wonderful, simple relaxation techniques that we all can learn. Paced breathing, types of meditation. Prayer is a wonderful relaxation technique for many people. There's a lot of these muscle relaxation. We can do a lot of these things on a daily basis to kind of help us take control of our physiology. Because remember, I told you, this response is not just a mental response, it's also a physiological response. And so if we can take control of our physiology, then we can kind of begin to calm ourselves down, because your brain will pick up on how your body feels or is acting. Or how it's responding, and then it will kind of put that into context. So if your body is having a stress response, then your brain will recognize that indeed as stress or threat, and you will have those kind of cognitive thoughts and feelings. Exercise is another great opportunity for coping. I know during my 7 weeks that I was home, my wife and I would exercise almost every day, and that was really very beneficial. It helps to get out to, say, go for a walk, or do whatever it is you do, play basketball with your kids. I mean, be more active is really the way to think about it. You don't have to get involved in a specific kind of exercise regime or regimen, but you need to be more active. And exercise really helps bring anxiety down. In addition, obviously, to help you deal with weight issues and just making you more physically healthy. Journaling is another thing that people find to be helpful as a coping strategy. Sitting down and writing down what you are thinking, what you are feeling. Some people do that in the context of a prayer journal. These are the types of things that I'm praying about. This is what I hear God saying to me. Or it just might be simply more like a diary, in the sense of, this is what happened to me today, this is how I'm feeling about it. And it gives you an opportunity to be able to go back and read what your thoughts and feelings were at periods in the past versus how you're feeling now, and see if there's a change. But it also gives you a chance to kind of get those things out of your head and put them out into the kind of the physical space. Enjoyable activities, starting a new hobby, whatever that might be. Going, watching a set of movies, or I noticed that my daughter and her friends have set up some kind of an online thing where they watch movies together, but they're all online. And they can all respond to it and talk about it while they're watching the movie. So, they're doing this as a regular thing each week. So you come up with a enjoyable activity that a hobby, coin collecting, stamp collecting, making wooden ducks, whatever it is that you enjoy, gardening, and you use that as a coping strategy. You bring that kind of pleasure and enjoyment and distraction back into your life. And then, as I said, prayer is a wonderful coping strategy. In fact, probably the primary coping strategy people use when you talk to individuals that are dealing with cancer or terminal illnesses, and you ask them how they deal with their stress. Prayer is often the number one technique that people will mention. And so these are all positive coping strategies. What you can see is they all are beneficial in the moment, but they also have some long-term beneficial effect where they're kind of helping you deal with the overall issue that you're having. They don't just they're just not a momentary fix. And so they're all very, very positive and all very, very beneficial. And you need to kind of look at your own life and say, how am I coping with my stress? Now, you might be saying to yourself right now, I don't use any coping strategies. I promise you do. Yeah, and it's either positive or negative. You don't call it a coping strategy, and you may not even consciously recognize it, but it's what you do. You do something when you're stressed out. So let's talk about some negative coping strategies. And I think, unfortunately, what you're going to find is that many of us, this is what we adopt, and we adopt it very kind of unconsciously. I think number one, and one that you see most commonly, is the use of alcohol and drugs. I know for a fact that people are drinking more. We're seeing that in surveys. I've even seen that among people that I know. People are drinking more alcohol during this period of time. And it's simply, alcohol does make you feel better in the moment. But in the long term, there's no positive benefit to consuming more alcohol to make yourself feel better because you're stressed out from a a traumatic experience. Ultimately, that's going to lead to even more problems. So alcohol and drugs are a tremendous negative coping strategy, but unfortunately a very common one. One that I've been seeing quite a bit is excessive spending. We're trapped at home. We're online. Now we have access to every store in the world in an instant. And, people are, filling up their front porch with Amazon Prime boxes. In fact, I even saw a story a few months ago that they actually are running out of cardboard because of that. So the reality is that excessive spending, it may make you feel better. Oh, I'm going to make the bedroom look better. I'm going to buy this. I've always wanted to get that. In a very short period of time, where a very measured purchase might make you feel better, and that's fine. But excessive spending, where you go beyond your budget and your means, ultimately that's going to come back to haunt you and be more of a negative consequence over time. In the moment you feel better, but long term you don't. You have to be careful. These are a lot of times things that we adopt as a coping strategy and don't even recognize that we've done it. Avoidance and isolation. And I don't just mean staying in your house because you're trying to stay away from people with the virus, but I mean avoidance of this situation like it doesn't even occur, or isolating yourself even from your family. This is the individual who say when they get stressed out, they go and get in the bed, take a lot of naps, they stay away from their family, they stay away from their coworkers, from their friends. This is the kind of person who just wants to be in the dark room. And it feels better when you're alone, but the reality is it only makes things worse over a longer period of time. Overeating, and that's a tremendous problem right now. We're trapped in the house, we're bored, we have a tendency to overeat. We're eating a lot of processed foods, we're not preparing meals with fresh foods, we may not even be able to get a hold of fresh foods. So overeating is a real negative consequence, and one that people kind of default to without really recognizing that that's an issue. And then kind of more of an extreme one perhaps would be self-harm. Individuals that are harming themselves. That might be something where they physically harm themselves, like cutting, or it might be involvement in risky behaviors. You might even look at, say, something like the use of drugs, of illegal drugs, as kind of a self-harm type of thing. The person isn't really trying to harm themselves, but that harmful experience gives them some release or catharsis, and so they feel better after that. It's an anxiety release. But again, in the long term, there's a lot of negative consequences there. So we need to be very wary of negative coping strategies and really look at those in our friends as well to make sure that they're not adopting those negative coping strategies and moving ourselves and others towards positive coping strategies, because positive coping strategies are going to benefit us in the long term. They're also going to give us a better opportunity to deal with these stressful situations on a daily basis. All right, so what are some things that we can do? Just some very simple things that we can do to maintain our mental health during this period of time. Number one, develop a routine and schedule. Don't just sit at home and just kind of wait for the world to fix itself. Develop a routine and schedule. If you normally get up to go to work at 7 o'clock, well, you're working from home, get up at 7 o'clock and go to work at home. Develop a routine and schedule. It has exercise in it, it has entertainment in it, it has family time in it. Develop that routine. It will make a huge difference in your life. Stay in contact with family and friends. Don't just isolate yourself. Connect. Talk to other people, even if that's through some type of technology. Exercise regularly. Just increase your activity. Go for a walk. Do some jumping jacks. Do an online workout program. It doesn't have to be an extreme exercise program. Just increase your activity. Eat healthy. Stay away from processed foods. Try to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. Eat healthy. Catch yourself when you're just snacking throughout the day. You don't want to put on a lot of extra weight because you're isolated in the home. Get plenty of sleep. If you're not sleeping well at night, take a nap during the day. Schedule that into your routine and schedule. Use those relaxation techniques to take control of your physiology. Pray and spiritually grow. Work on your spiritual life. This is a great opportunity to draw closer to God, to draw closer in fellowship within Bible studies and things like that. You can use Zoom or Skype. There's a great opportunity here. Pray, spiritually grow. Be involved in pleasurable activities. You got a lot of extra time on your hand. Why not start a hobby? Why not garden? Why not read? Do something that brings you some pleasure. Don't just sit around and be concerned about what might be. And then also, let's check on our neighbors. This is a great chance for you to get to know your neighbors if we don't know our neighbors. Just give them a phone call. Walk out into their driveway and kind of yell up and see if they're okay. Check on your neighbors. Get involved with those in your community. And here are some things to avoid, because these are the things that really are driving a lot of this anxiety, a lot of this stress. The 24-hour news cycle. The 24-hour news cycle is a nightmare, okay? You cannot get away from it. And these guys are not really providing us with meaningful information. They're just trying to fill time most of the time. It's just people talking about things. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And so schedule into your routine times in which you're going to get information. Like I myself, in the morning, I have a set of websites that I look at to get news of the day. And in the afternoon, I have one single news program that I watch, which is a news program. It's not a commentary program. It's a news program so that I can get the coronavirus information for that day. And that's it. The rest of the day, I stay away from the news because it's just overwhelming. It's absolutely overwhelming. Excessive TV and internet use. I mean, this is, we're going to find ourselves on the couch and we've got, 5 million channels to look at and on-demand movies, and we just sit there and do nothing. That is a negative coping strategy. We have to be able to do things a little bit better than that. So let's not find ourselves, incessantly watching the internet or incessantly playing video games, incessantly watching TV. Let's schedule that in. Let's be reasonable about that use. Negative peers. It's not time to get some drinking buddies, in a sense. It's not time to connect with extremist individuals online that are kind of driving negative thoughts. So let's stay away from that. As I said, avoid alcohol and drugs, avoid isolation. As we said, try to connect with others. And then also finally, the last thing we want to avoid is negative self-talk. We don't need to find ourselves in our home talking to ourselves about how horrible and terrible things are going to be. That's catastrophizing. Things are going to work out. I promise you that. And the reality is that if we sit at home and we just constantly kind of catastrophize and negative talk, we will convince ourselves this is the end, this is a catastrophe that we can't overcome, and we will find ourselves in the throes of depression. So finally, as in ending, let's talk about this from a more spiritual perspective. We live in a fallen world. And this is not, although for many of us it may be, but this is not the first pandemic that's ever occurred. There has been epidemics and plagues and outbreaks and pandemics that have occurred throughout human history. And there will be others that will occur in human history. This is not the first, and it's not going to be the last. There have been other economic downturns, and there will be other economic downturns in the future. This is not the first. Again, it's not the last. This is just a symptom of a fallen world that we live in. We have to have some anchor, some foundation that keeps us steady as we kind of are being kind of blown around by this world that we live in, the situations that come up on us. So we really have to look back to Christ, and we have to understand that that is the foundation, that is the anchor that we hold on to. So let's look at a verse from Romans 8 that I really think kind of helps us get some grounding and some understanding. And it's really where we should start in the context of trying to move beyond some of these traumatic experiences. So this is what Paul writes in Romans 8. Can anything ever separate us from Christ's love? Does it mean he no longer loves us if we have trouble or calamity, or are persecuted or hungry or destitute or in danger or threatened with death? No, despite all these things, overwhelming victory is ours through Christ who loved us. And I'm convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love, neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither our fears for today nor our worries about tomorrow, not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. No power in the sky above or in the earth below. Indeed, nothing in all of creation will ever be able to separate us from the love of God that is revealed in Christ Jesus our Lord. I mean, there it is right there. I mean, Paul's written it out for us. No matter what is happening to us, this was a time of great persecution, a time of oppression, of a conquering nation that had taken over the Jews. And yet, Paul could say Christ was our foundation. Nothing will take us out of his hand. Nothing will take us away from his love. And certainly a pandemic isn't going to do that. The pandemic didn't surprise God. He's certainly still in control. And we need to start each day by saying to ourselves, nothing can separate us from Christ's love. Connect with God in the morning. Connect with God throughout the day as we practice some of these positive coping strategies. And I think what we'll find is that we're more grounded as the winds of pandemic change come and go. And we will be able to kind of navigate this situation in a healthy way and help others do the same things. Thanks for joining me.